Ashley, and I'm a reporter with the National Post, so I cover a lot of issues to do with how the government is dealing with the sharing economy. So I'm here to talk a little bit more about the politics and challenges that politicians face in trying to tackle something as big as the sharing economy. And I think one of the most important things is that, most people like it, right? Uber saves us money, Airbnb makes it cheaper to travel, it's fun to find neat things on Etsy. And I think that's a big part of the challenge for politicians is if they try to take something away that people like, that's when people are going to use their voice. They're going to, tweet or call their city councilor or share a meme or whatever. And that's when people tend to get more engaged in politics, is when they feel like something's being taken away. So I think that sort of makes the easy answer like, well, politicians should just enable the economy. They should just do whatever they can to allow the sharing economy to exist as it's happening. But that too is a little bit too simple, because if you think about the example of a city like Niagara Falls that's already been really hard hit since the recession, lost a lot of revenue, it depends a lot on hotel taxes. So what happens somewhere like that if the province were to just say, hey, Airbnb and all the home sharing apps, go at it? That city loses a lot of revenue, so that too can become a political liability for the province. So it's a lot more complex than just one issue. And I think the best way to look at it is actually to break it into 4 categories: consumers, existing stakeholders, lobbying, and legislation. So I know Noah's touched on a bit of this, but I think when it comes to consumers, those who use these apps really like them. Those who don't generally don't tend to care what government does with them, but they can be swayed to believe it's a really bad idea. So I use the example of my mom. She called me the other day when I was taking an Uber, and she lives in Kitchener and they just got it, so she hasn't used it yet. And when I told her I was in an Uber, she went on this rant about how it's not safe, you shouldn't do that, you should just take a normal taxi. And without ever having any experience with it, she had this view that was colored partly by media coverage, but that in and of itself is sort of an act of politics. And that leads well into the existing stakeholders, the taxi industry, insurance companies. They're powerful groups that know how to get both politicians and media attention, and that can dictate and frame a lot of the debate and how it proceeds going forward. And because they're so effective at lobbying, that also helps, because they're so effective at lobbying, that also helps them make their case. But now we're starting to see companies like Uber are really starting to get into the lobbying game themselves. They've been doing a lot of work in Toronto in particular in rallying their customer base to help them lobby city councillors and show that there is a public appetite to make sure that this sticks around in the city. But they're also going the more traditional route. They've hired a lot of former political staff from both Queen's Park and City Hall to help them make their case. And they've hired a really big traditional government relations firm to sort of help them move things along in the back rooms. And so in those back rooms is when they start talking about what we're going to do about legislation. And Winston Churchill once said, if you have 10,000 regulations, you destroy all respect for the law. The rise of the sharing economy is in many ways a rejection of the 10,000 regulations of the past. People know they're operating outside of the law, and they don't really care. And so when people are dismissive of the law, that's a challenge for politicians and a sign to them that they should probably be doing more to keep pace with the times. So some provinces are now trying. Ontario was engaged in a review of the whole sharing economy. Whatever that massive umbrella term really means, as Noah, it explained quite well. It's not necessarily just Uber and Airbnb. Some people debate that they aren't even part of it, but there are tool sharing things in little local communities that people consider part of the sharing economy. It's really broad, and you can't just put in one bill for the whole sharing economy because it crosses ministries. Even just one thing like Airbnb crosses from health to housing to the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. So provincially, we have former PC leader Tim Hudak has a private member's bill, to actually go ahead and legalize Uber, Airbnb, all home sharing, and parking sharing across the province. So this would prevent city halls from individually having to deal with this, and it sets some strict regulations. And he's actually engaged in dealing with the insurance companies to talk about, how can we make this work for you and for Uber drivers and keep consumers happy. And so when that bill came up for a second reading, a bunch of Liberal cabinet ministers actually voted for it, partly because they don't want to be framed as voting against the sharing economy, but also because I'm told that they're pretty close to bringing forward their own set of reviews and rules for parts of that aspect of the industry. And then the other really interesting thing is that the provincial New Democrats are really opposed to the bill, and not necessarily because they're 100% against people using a home sharing app like Airbnb to make a bit more money off of an asset they already own, but because they worry that a lot of these newfangled apps are actually just another way our traditional standards of labor, our traditional forms of work as set out in law, and the way we live our lives are being undermined by upstart companies like Uber that aren't regulated. So in Quebec, they're actually going the way of wanting to regulate Airbnb as well by putting everybody under the same rules as other tourist lodgings, which means you actually have to be inspected and certified as like a suitable place for tourists to stay. So this has operators pretty upset that it's a bunch of red tape they're going to have to deal with, and some consumers worry that it will be even more expensive to stay in Quebec, especially if they were using Airbnb to save money to begin with. So what makes the sharing economy so tough for politicians is they really can't win. They might get a few consumer-friendly news stories, but they will also get the scary warnings about change and the supposed dangers therein. Big stakeholders and donors might fight them, either through the media or even in court. And so to paraphrase poet John Lydgate, you can't please all of the people some of the time, but you can please some of them. And who the politicians choose to please is what will dictate whether the next Uber for whatever ends up on your phone or stuck in legal limbo.